Hey guys, Mrs. Erickson here. Um, Ready to start reading again. We are about halfway through chapter 6. We're just going to read a few pages today. I think we have about 13 pages left, so we'll try and read as many as we can. But this is the library from Beauty and the Beast. I don't know if you can see it all, but that's it. Kind of fun. So yesterday, remember Buck was saved by John Thornton, and he has basically fallen in love with him. He loves him. He thinks he's awesome, and he cares for him, and talks about how he feels love and like he's never felt it. But this is the part of the book that I think a lot of people that saw the movie preview anyway, this is the part that they know, that they see. This is the part that John Thornton is the one that is played by Harrison Ford. So I think this is the part where most of the book we think of, but I don't know if you can see, but we were like 3/4 of the way through the book before we really met him. Anyway, all right, so picking up from yesterday. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He alone among men could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too great for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day, they had grub-staked themselves from the proceeds of the raft and left Dawson for the headwaters of the Tanana. The men and the dogs were sitting on the crest of a cliff which fell away, straight down, to naked bedrock 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge. Buck at his shoulder. Sorry, he was near the edge, Buck at his shoulder. A thoughtless whim seized Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete to the experiment he had in mind. Jump, Buck, he commanded, sweeping his arm out and over the chasm. The next instant, he was grappling with Buck at the extreme edge, while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. It's uncanny, Pete said after it was over and they caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. No, it is splendid, and it is terrible too. Do you know, it sometimes makes me afraid. I'm not hankering to be a man that lays hand on you while he's around, Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head toward Buck. By Jingo, was Hans's contribution. Not mine self either. It was at Circle City ere the year was out that Pete's apprehension was realized. Black Burton, a man evil-tempered and malicious, had been pricking a quarrel with the tenderfoot at the bar when Thornton stepped good-naturedly between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burton struck out, without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning and saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but was hurled backward to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove it again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. But while the surgeon checked out the bleeding, he prowled up and down, growling ferociously, attempting to rush in and being forced back by an array of hostile clubs. A miners' meeting called on the spot decided that the dog was had sufficient provocation, and Buck was discharged, but his reputation was made, and from that day his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life in quite another fashion. The three partners were lining a long and narrow poling boat down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, snubbing with a thin manila rope from tree to tree, while Thornton remained in the boat, helping the descent by means of a pole and shouting directions to the shore. Buck on the bank, worried and anxious, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot, where a ledge of barely submerged rock jutted out into the river, Hans Hans cast off the rope, and while Thornton pulled the boat out into the stream, ran down the bank with the end of his in his hand to snub the boat when it had cleared the ledge. This it did, and was flying downstream in a current as swift and as a mill race. When Hans checked it with the rope and checked too suddenly, the boat flirted over and snubbed into the bank bottom up, while Thornton flung sheer out of it. Was carried downstream toward the worst parts of the rapids, a stretch of wild water in which no swimmer could live. Buck had sprung in on the instant, and at the end of the 300 yards, amid the mad swirls of water, he overhauled Thornton. When he felt him grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress shoreward was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From below came the fatal roars where the wild current went wider and was rent in shreds and spray by the rocks which thrust through like the teeth of an enormous comb. The suck of the water as it took the beginning of the last steep pitch was frightful, and Thornton knew that the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over a rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched his slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of the churning waters shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own and swept on downstream, struggling desperately, but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high as though for a last look, then turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans, at the very point where swimming ceased to be possible and destruction began. So there's a picture of Buck pulling him out of the water. They knew that the time a man could cling to a slippery rock in the face of that driving current was a matter of minutes, and they ran as fast as they could up the bank to a point far above where Thornton was hanging on. They attached the line with which they had been snubbing the boat to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it should neither strangle him nor impede his swimming, and launched him into the stream. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered the mistake too late, when Thornton was abreast of him and the bare half-dozen strokes away while he was being carried helplessly past. Hans promptly snubbed with the rope as though Buck were a boat. The rope thus tightened on him in the sweep of the current. He was jerked under the surface, and under the surface he remained until his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to them, and though they could not make out the words of it, they knew that he was in his extremity. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet, ran up the bank ahead of the men to the point of his previous departure. Again the rope was attached and he was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but he would not be guilty of it a second time. Hans paid out the rope, permitted no slack, while Pete kept it clear of coils. Buck held on till he was on the line straight above Thornton. When he turned, and with the speed of an express train headed down upon him, Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a battering ram with the whole force of the current behind him, he reached up and closed with both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans snubbed the rope around the tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water, strangling, suffocating, sometimes one uppermost and sometimes the other. Dragging under the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and snags, they veered in to the bank. Thornton came to, belly downward, and being violently propelled back and forth across the drift log by Hans and Pete. His first glance was for Buck, under whose limp and apparently lifeless body Nig was setting up a howl, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes. Thornton was himself bruised and battered, and he went carefully over to Buck's body when he had been brought around, finding 3 broken ribs. "That settles it," he announced. "We camp right here." And camp they did till Buck's ribs knitted and he was able to travel. That winter at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit, not so heroic perhaps, but one that put his name many notches higher on the totem pole of Alaskan fame. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the three men, for they stood in need of the outfit which it furnished, and were enabled to make a long desirable trip into the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the Eldorado saloon, in which men waxed boastfully of their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his record, was the target of these men, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. Pooh, said John Thornton. Buck can start 1,000 pounds. And break it out and walk off with it 100 yards? Demanded Mathewson, a bonanza king, he of the 700 vaunt. And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. Well, Mathewson said, slow and deliberately, so that all could hear. I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And there it is. So saying, he slammed a sack of gold dust off the size of a bologna sausage and down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds, half a ton. That enormousness of it appalled him. He had great faith in Buck's strength and had often thought him capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it, and eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. All right, so I'm going to stop there because we've got a few pages left, but I want to make sure we have enough to read for tomorrow to finish chapter 6. And then we will move on to chapter 7, and it looks like chapter 7 is the end of the book. It's quite long, but that's okay. We'll finish it soon. You guys have a great day. Thanks for listening.